without further ado then, we will get to the next panel and the last panel on measurement. So we've been talking around measurement a lot, and now we're going to get to the heart of the matter. So Arthur A. Cullen, please introduce your panel. And
Great. Thank you, Patrick. So I'm really delighted to have this panel. Data is one of those things that academics tend to get pretty geeky about and excited. But it's not only because I'm an academic and I think it's fun to find new and better ways to measure, but as has been discussed already today, we really need more and better data to know how people are living, where we need to invest, how to monitor progress in housing population across the world, and particularly in emerging market economies where the current data apparatus is really severely lacking. And so today I'm really excited to have speakers who will be able to speak at different levels of building up that data infrastructure and describe that data agenda that is needed to really better serve population across the world in housing them. We have Mick Silver with an independent advisor, but worked formerly with IMF on developing methodology for housing price index. Denise yesterday mentioned how prior to the GFC, most focus was really on just very big aggregate macro data on GDP inflation, and then asset prices became more of a topic, particularly in advanced economies. In most emerging markets, the issue is not so much of how big of a macro risk come from lending, since lending is so small as we saw this morning, but still being able to have good measures of how price are moving and for different segments is extremely important. And so I'm excited to have Mick talk about that. Then Nancy Lozano Gracia, a lead economist at the World Bank, will be able to talk about some of the really exciting advances that have been made in combining some new remote sensing data and survey data and trying to find new ways of capturing urban growth, urban development, population, housing quality. There are things that are really basic. Some of the numbers that Richard mentioned yesterday about what share of the population live in slums, even just what share of the population is urban, that we really don't have good data about. And there is so many differences across countries in how they are measured, what definition of a city is, what the definition of slums or housing deficits are, that we really need to improve both methodology and data collection to address those questions. I don't know if some of you followed some of the debates, but for example, remote sensing imagery is now increasingly used to define urban areas. But one of the definitions of urban areas that was developed by a team supported by the European Commission came up with a number where 84% of the population would be classified as urban. Other teams at NYU responded with another set of estimates where they think that 52% of the population is urban. And so if we can't really agree that 52 or 84% of the population is urban, we really don't know much about anything that has to do with urban development and housing, right? It's like some of those very basic facts, if it's somewhere between 50 and 80%, it's really somewhere between 0 and 100%, and we haven't really refined much more than that after having done a lot of work on it. And so our last but certainly not least speaker, Kecia, will talk about how in countries where really we basically don't know if it's between 0 and 1, how do you go about trying to put together numbers, trying to find very creative ways of approximating what housing activity might be like, what the contribution of housing to the economy might be like, and then refining those numbers over time once you show to government that it really matters. And so yes, we need data, we need accurate and current data. The world is changing fast, urbanization is happening fast, and so we can't have decennial census data from 2010 still really informing decision today. And we need data that is temporal and spatially specific. It's really important for housing to know not only where housing is built, how much housing is built, but who is it serving, what share of the income distribution. And so I'm really excited by all the development that have been taken place in recent years in terms of data collection, processing, and availability, but that there are more sources beyond survey that are being used. Remote sensing is one of the big sources spatial data, but we are also able to have data about rental and for sale markets based on digital traces, based on all of the online platforms that are being used. We are able to use things like transaction and cell phone use to know the quality of borrowers and be able to do underwriting. So there are a lot of more sources that are available, and we are still figuring out how to use them effectively to support access to housing. So that, I think, will be really, really exciting in coming decades to see how it evolves. I want to conclude that introduction with a shout out to the work that Maria has done with the Housing Finance Network and Hofinet, that she has developed this framework to create consistent quality indicators for a wide range of countries. And so for any of you who haven't yet used Hofinet, I'm sure many of you in the room have relied on it over the years. It's a fantastic resource, hofinet.org. Many of you have also contributed to create those indicators and populate them. And that's really a labor of love. And I hope that this conference can show that housing matters, and that if we think that we take housing seriously as a development sector, we need to invest in a data agenda. We need to support the work that Maria has been doing and is doing with investment, both human investment and financial investment, to support that work. So I'm going to turn out to Mick, who is going to start.
Thank you, Arthur. And so this work is based on my time at the IMF, which I'm now happily retired from. Just retired, never mind. And so I've got to put the usual disclaimer. I forget this functionary stuff about this work in no way reflects the views of the IMF and blah, blah, blah. But the focus of the IMF and my work is very special. Denise's presentation from the BIS is very similar in this respect. We used to work together, in fact. And that is, it's a central bank perspective. And what we're interested in is housing bubbles, and particularly when they burst, and the terrible repercussions they have. And it's not just in the countries in which they do. It spreads, the recession, the 2008 recession we all know about. It spreads all over the developed and less developed world. And it's not the only, even though I'll focus on this need for monitoring bubbles and measuring house price indices, of course, it's not the only work the IMF does on housing. And there's a site, the IMF Global Watch, which I'll draw your attention to. And that lists, and it's a very comprehensive site, and it lists all the work the IMF is doing on housing. And so I put that plug in. We were working on house price indices very early on and building it up, but the real stimulus came with the 2008 recession and the bubble that was burst from it, and the G20 meeting, which asked organizations such as ours to look for data gaps, so next time this sort of thing happens, they're better prepared and to monitor it. And one of these was with residential property price indices and house price indices, and to get that moving. And the IMF took a lead on this type of thing. And it did do some very positive things. First, there was a manual handbook that came out, which I referenced, and something that Arthur has a full list of references. And this gave international standards on measurement, which was very, very important. And I'm a methodologist, so we've been working on developing these methods, and there's still papers coming out. There's one recently out that do this. And I think we've got the methodology cleared up. It's the data that's the problem, which is the theme of this presentation. Some of our achievements wasn't just in that we wrote these manuals and handbooks of how to do, but we're sufficiently well funded that we did training courses right the way throughout the less developed emerging economies, even the advanced economies, on all of this. We must have given presentations in week-long or two-week-long courses to about 40, 60 countries, even more, on how to adopt these types of things. And the adoption in advanced economies came from very little, very, very quickly, to substantial work. And you'll see that most G20 countries, EC, of course, by law, they have to have these hedonic price indices now for housing. And it's been a success. And we go to countries, even if they don't actually adopt it, where we do technical assistance missions directly to help them develop them, as well as the training. And post-conflict countries, a whole range of countries you'd never imagine would be interested in, are now setting out and looking at the start. But the start is data, and that's the important thing. So if you look at the blue inset, these are the data sources that we'll talk to countries about. And it'll vary countries by country. The land registry, the deeds office, is an important source of data because we're looking at house price indices, how the prices change over time. And the land registry, if there's a good one, and if there's a good means in electronic form and timely, as well as good measurement, you know, that's quite excellent, of course. But you get things where they aren't timely. And you can see in the things that go around the side of that blue things, there's criteria such as timeliness and other things that comes in. The UK is terrible. People who know the UK here, and I know, I see Vernon is a fellow Brit down there. The search time between actually making a transaction and getting it registered in the deed office is huge. I mean, it's just of no use in that sort of context. Lender data is very popular, and there we go to the banking institutions who lend data. If we get access of their records, we're very well placed as another data source. That would be something we'd obviously look to. These estate agents, these realtors, you look at Realtor.com, you look at Zillow, there's a huge amount of information. And this information is very, very important. And it's linked, of course, Zillow and Realtor.com, to the actual purchase price. It not only has the asking price, but you have the purchase. And then there are other sources within it. And you notice going around the blue thing, those quadrants. And you can see the coverage is important. But then some of these sources don't work. For example, if we go to lenders, we don't get a coverage of cash payments within it. And you can see all these issues impacting on the different source that they have. If you go to realtors, for example, and they don't have the final closing price, all they've got is the asking price, well, that might be timely. Much more timely than transaction. At least you've got something to work on. But the price is the asking price. And you can see one of the quadrants is whether the price is the asking transaction appraisal. And everything has got its advantages and disadvantages. An important thing is the quality mix adjustment you'll see on the top right. And so what happens is you get a set of transactions in the first quarter, you get a set of transactions in the second, and it's just what happens. These are the data that comes on into you. And it may be that more houses sold in the second quarter in Bethesda than in the first quarter, whilst in the first quarter it was more Southeast DC or something like that. And so the price increase isn't anything to do with a real average price change, but it's the quality mix of what's been sold within that. So the price inflation is illusionary. So what happens is you need to adjust these measures for quality. And the major recommendation of the manuals and the way that we teach and the way that it is adopted, it's compulsory in the EU countries, for example, is the hedonic. So regression is run with the price and all the quality characteristics. I'll talk more about this later. And there you get an estimate of the marginal valuation of an extra bedroom, more houses in a different location, and etc. as we go through. And you make the quality adjustment. And all of this methodology and econometric issues, I referenced 2 papers, are very well worked out now. That's not the problem. It's the data that we have to build on. So let me talk about some data issues. And this is as good as it gets. Let me just talk it can be really good. For example, the United States, since we're here and we're talking to these people, you don't actually use this data source, which you should. You don't use hedonic methods. You use what's called the repeat sales, the Case-Shiller methodology. And but just talking about if you were using hedonic, the United States, the Zillow database, the Bureau of Economic Analysis has this database. It comprised 300 million transaction prices on residential properties, 300 million. For each of these residential prices, each of these transactions, you may have about 300 variables as to the characteristics of the houses. These would include locational variables, variables such as the size, how many bedrooms, how many square feet, whether it's got a front yard, backyard, the size of the front yard, the backyard, whether it's got a swimming pool, a garage, etc. Everything that Zillow thinks is price determining is by definition on these types of databases, and the same with Realtor.com, etc. It gets even more because when you've got an address, you've got an identifier, so you can link to another database. So what they do is they link to databases maybe geographically by zip code or whatever. For example, you'll see on Zillow schools that within it. And you'll also see a measure of the quality of the schools because they can link that in. So you know the housing, the area, the quality of the schools, and everything about that going on. You'll also see it linked to a crime database, so you know the crime level. The BEA has linked it to census data. So they've taken the whole of the Zillow and they've now linked that to the census. So you know the socio-demographic makeup of that particular transaction that's taken place, of the area within it. I've looked at there's a fantastic website that you just type in an address. It's a bit more complicated than this, but effectively you type in an address and you get the longitude and latitude of the address. And from that, you just need to know the longitude and latitude of the metro station or downtown or workplace. And in its simplest form, then you just do a linear thing and you get distance to facilities within it, distance to rail stations. Now, the housing literature, I'm more familiar with the statistics and economics literature, but the housing literature is full of this type of stuff. And they've long ago dismissed linear these types of linear measures, or the non-linear ones. The UK for years have been used time to travel to work. You look on Google Maps between any 2 points, you know exactly where the traffic is and the time. All of the potential is huge in this type of thing. So one of the themes is it's not just data, it's linking databases, and with residential property, you've got an identifier to link it with. Just to move very quickly on, people make their own luck. That's my second theme. This is not just as good as it just gets. You've got to make your luck in this, and this is what we preach to the countries within it. The UK, for example, published its first house price index, which was based on a sample, and almost quoting, of a few banks, a few lending establishments. When a statistical authority says a sample of a few, what it means is none, almost. They're just too embarrassed to admit how small it is within that. But that's how you start. You start developing your methodology, you get a small database, and then they gradually, over a 10-year period, increase the whole thing until they've got a very good data set, and then they adopted, much more recently, the hedonic approach within it. These things are built over a long, long time, and are important to do so. You make your luck in this respect. You may think, well, you can't use banking data for the Swiss. They'll never let that out. The Swiss have convinced all of the lending authorities to release to their statistical office individual transaction data on buying and selling. And if the Swiss can do it, I mean, anyone can do it. It's just fantastic within that. The French, I have to. The French have been fantastic because, and this is a Brit saying this about, because what the French do have is a notary system. And so when you buy and sell a house, you go to a local notary. There's about 5,000-6,000 of them. They're small offices and everything. And you register the sale, and they draw up the deeds and collect the stamp duties as a result of it. And it's monopolistic. You have to go through this mechanism. And back in the days, come on, America, back in the day, they used to sort of have all these papers which they got on in, and then after about 3 months, they'd send them off to the deeds office and everything, because it's just individual small establishments. And then they upped their game, I remember, after about 5 years or something, because faxes came in, so they started faxing a few, but others wouldn't and everything. But they still started the Association of Notaries started compiling the indices on behalf of their members. And then finally, emails, and finally, a more electronic system. And it was built up gradually over many years. And you'd think from that system, it's impossible to collect it. You haven't got a deeds office in a normal way, but they did it. And this is, you look for the country, you look at the way they buy and sell their houses, and you try and find data as a result of it. So, very, very briefly with the whole thing. So, I'm ignoring rental, and rental's important. So, I say that. I know there's a sample selectivity bias in what we get. We usually, especially for developing and emerging countries, what's on a deeds register, what goes through a lot of these things, these sources, isn't right. It's mainly the wealthier properties and things like this. I know that there's inaccurate data in a lot of these sources because because it's tax avoidance go on, because this is what we find out from countries within the whole thing. I know in some countries, like Oman, they laughed at me. They said, we don't buy and sell houses because somebody's bought one a few generations ago with a lot of land, and with their extended families, they just build on. And this extended families buying and things, I see it in Hanoi where they build it on. The properties up just higher, and as new family members come on in. And in Africa, you see similar types of things and everything. And I know that we're missing out on the informal and traditional sector, but I don't care. And the reason I don't care is because we've got two experts here next to me who are going to fill in this important gap, and I can pass this very difficult buck over to them. So we're focusing on a very top-down, in my work, sort of way. And the friends we have, because of the nature of, and these are the positives, because of the nature of who we are the central banks, because they're desperate for these types of measures, because they want to identify the bubbles and things like this. A monetary policy committee has to have some data to talk about. So, and they've got leverage, the central banks, over lending authorities, the other banks, so that to release and coordinate this. Ministry of Finances for taxations and the central statistical bureaus. So this top-down thing comes in, but we don't do the valuable work, which is my colleagues here are going to talk about on it. Electronic data. I see electronic data so important to this. I mean, who would have thought mobile phones would have taken off in Africa in the way they do? And so will electronic data and buying and selling properties as it emerges. And once that takes place, then the whole thing starts linking up, because what we want is timely data, and timely data comes from electronic transactions being pushed through. So the positives, I'm happy about those things. South Africa I was going to talk about, but I think Kecia will pick more of that up. So again, a buck being passed without any sort of preparation there. And the merger of databases, as I've mentioned before. So that's the sort of stuff we do, and thank you.
Thank you. Nancy?
Okay. Excellent. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here. What I thought I'll do is I'll maybe take us back to reflect on some of the challenges in terms of data that we see in many of the developing countries that we in the World Bank work with, and then maybe bring some examples of the work that our teams at the bank have been doing to try to fill those gaps. Not on a comprehensive summary of the work that has been doing, but hopefully as a way to pick your interest and start a conversation. So maybe just to take us back to the why is it that we want good data on the housing sector. And I feel a little bit like preaching to the choir, but I also feel it's important for us to remember, because we have to speak in many places about this. So remembering that really it is a matter of informing policy making, informing where is it that investments need to happen, where is it, how to provide the right foundations for markets to flourish, but also after interventions, after policy changes and investments have happened, important for monitoring, for evaluation, but also for engagement of communities. So in that, let's say, with that in mind as an objective of why we want to discuss about data, we also have to think about the multiple areas that touch upon housing. And I think I put here a slide on the housing strategy at the bank so that you can see the wide span of areas that are included in that strategy, which is also reflected in the program of the conference in the last 2 days. That to emphasize that these pieces of data will be needed across all those areas to start putting the puzzle together. Today, the examples that I'll bring are only on the left side of that arrow. So just to say it's not the whole array of areas is important, but I'll just focus on a couple of examples given the time limitation. So I like to start usually with this graph, with this figure, because it brings us to the reality, to what we see sometimes on the ground when we go to the countries where we work and to the cities where we work. This is a picture taken by a colleague who went some years ago to the city of Chiclayo in Peru, a city of more than 500,000 population, and this was their urban plan. This is what the city knew about how the city was growing, where residential or houses were constructed, where was the city growing, basically lack of information, nothing digitized. This is a common problem in many of the places that we work. Not to say that there are not places that have also done great work. And I like to bring the example of Mexico as a country that has managed to invest in data from starting early on, I would say, compared to many other countries, with the challenges that they face, but a good example for many of the countries we work on setting a unique identifier, like Mick was just mentioning, that that has allowed them today to have a system that brings different data sets together, and that provides data services that are used by consumers, by developers, by the government, and by the banking sector. But we have many more examples also like Chiclayo. So how do we start thinking about how to solve those gaps and start getting the pieces of the puzzle when we don't have any better data? And that's where some years ago we actually started looking into satellite imagery and using imagery to start to understand that point that Arthur was mentioning at the very beginning, how cities are expanded, how urbanization is happening, and just even to get a sense of the boundaries of the city and the different land uses. So we use satellite imagery to get a sense of the in that case, land cover, and start classifying where is it that residential areas were expanding, where is it that commercial areas were growing, where is it that informal areas were present in the city. And that allows us to open a conversation with policymakers on how their cities were growing, where is it that they needed to put attention, perhaps because regulation was too stringent, because they were misguiding development of residential houses into risky areas, or to also get a better sense of what were differences, for example, in housing quality in informal and formal areas when this data was not available. So we could use this classification from satellite images, for example, to gather additional information at the household level by designing a sample, actually using those areas that were identified as informal for the definition of the stratification in the survey. More recently, we have been partnering with with DLR, the German Space Agency, that has made available a product that they call the World Settlement Footprint that actually provides these urban footprints for the world. And they have made it available from 1985 to 2015. So there is evolution in time. There is a time span in their information. Again, not perfect, many challenges, but it takes us a step forward into putting those pieces together. In their more recent product, they have added to the 2015 data information on heights, building heights. So this is the first time we start getting an understanding also of actual heights in the city that can take us into a discussion of, for example, overcrowding. And we have used that actually to inform the discussions and to inform the design of some interventions that are not necessarily directly linked to the housing sector, but instead use information, let's say, a proxy of the quality of the housing stock here to improve targeting of interventions. Here is an example in Kinshasa. In DRC, as COVID was evolving, the government wanted to provide additional support to households, to vulnerable households. And in that case, there was no information from the census to actually start targeting this help that the government, or these cash transfers that the government wanted to give out. So we use this information on building height, on the distribution and the form of the city to identify what the team called hotspots, areas that were overcrowded and where social distancing was impossible. Then overlaying this information with additional efforts, focusing on these hotspots, on access to basic services, the government we worked jointly on identifying where we thought the most vulnerable households would be, and that actually led to the design of the targeting scheme. So another way in which the teams have been actually trying to breach these information gaps is by collecting other types of images. In this case, images, for example, that are taken by a camera that is on top of a car that goes through the area of interest, surveying and taking pictures of the area. Or images that are collected by drones, again, with a predefined area in mind. And what that allows, combined with some machine learning algorithms, is to extract some characteristics of the housing stock, of the neighborhood, of the infrastructure, what's visible in an image, of course, that of the infrastructure that is available in that neighborhood. And then that can be used in many ways also to inform the dialogue, to inform decision making. For example, our teams in San Martin use this to assess, I was talking about monitoring and evaluation, to assess the speed of the reconstruction programs after a hurricane. It was also used to identify houses that needed retrofitting of roofs, again, after a hurricane hit. But in Padang in Indonesia, this similar analysis was also used to identify houses that were showing some quality deficiencies and that potentially could be supported with government programs. This kind of information actually allows the government to assess the first case, to monitor in the speed of interventions, where things are happening, where things are lagging, but in the other cases also to assess the extent of the needs and what would be the interventions, and perhaps identify areas that may be targeted because needs are evident there. Let me just close by bringing us back to the full span, because I think it's important to emphasize that all the examples are just pieces of the puzzle, of the data puzzle. And that yes, they take us a little bit closer to understanding what are the challenges, where are the problems, and what needs to be done. But we cannot look at a piece in isolation, and that goes back to the point that Mick was saying. It is important to have as many pieces as we can together to get a real understanding. And I want to take us back to a point that was made in the discussion in the first panel as well. These pieces of the puzzle are not enough. We need to think about building the capacities to collect, to analyze, and to maintain this data. And that way we can actually get the pieces of the puzzle, but also be able to put them together. So let me stop here.
Thank you very much. It's such a treat to be here. Thank you for the invitation and for the conversation and all the presentations. I've really enjoyed it. And this is a conversation that we're having right now, which is quite close to my heart, something that I've been thinking a lot about. And that's mostly Maria's fault. Because really just the way in which she's always presented the rationale for particular approaches to be taken have been strongly rooted in the data. And if we want, we don't have enough money to do things badly. And so therefore we really have to understand what the circumstances are and what are all the parameters that contribute to a particular policy choice or intervention we want to make. And for that, we need really good information. The other thing that good information does is it builds trust. And it's sort of its own chicken and egg. So good information builds trust. Trust leads to the availability of good information. And that brings different parties together, whether it's the state or the private sector, or even households and how they share their information. And as Nancy has said, we need to pull data from so many different sources so that we can build the thickness of our understanding along that value chain. And so thinking about the relationship between data and trust building in the information you have and also in the housing process as it evolves, I think is an important part of the work we've been doing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a process that we've been undergoing with a number of colleagues, and we collaborate widely with many different organizations. And the first, I guess, framing idea is work that we've been doing with Rial and then a company called 71.4, where we've been trying to articulate a data agenda for housing in Africa. And to do that, we took a step back and went really simple. So this is the value chain, Nancy, that you presented, simplified perhaps even further, where we have 7 categories. We have 4 value chain categories of indicators: land, construction, sales and rental, so offtake, and then management and maintenance. And then we have 3 context sets of indicators that relate to the macroeconomic environment, the enabling environment, and then the demand side, so demographics. And within that, we started by saying, well, what did we want to know? And we identified, I don't know, I think we started with 400 things we wanted to know. And then we whittled it down, and we brought it down to 300, and eventually we got down to about 115 things we wanted to know. And we thought, let's just go see if we can find this information in different countries. And we went to 8 and then finally 9 countries in total where we explored this. And as part of the exercise of doing that, we looked at the regulatory frameworks that supported the housing construction and management process. And where did the different players along the value chain have to account to the regulator? And was that not something that might create some data, because those were points of activity that were being monitored by the governance framework? So there was a lot that was in it. And when we got to the end of the process, this is an image of Kenya, and I won't go through everything, but just so you can see what we did. Across the very top, we've got the different public sector institutions that participate in some way of either observing or regulating housing delivery and ongoing management in Kenya. So that includes, it's the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, it's the central bank, it's the land department, and so on. And we looked at what is the data that they are collecting because it's their job, or because it is particular to how they regulate the industry or how they regulate companies. How are they, where are they getting information from? And could we take that information and shift it, identify that as housing relevant data that then could be captured and shared back into the market as useful information that then investors and market players would use to develop their investment strategies. And so the recommendation back to the public sector in Kenya was specifically about looking, I actually have it right here, yes, that's easier to read, to look at, is there data that exists that can be unlocked, that is being collected, that the regulator is collecting and isn't sharing with anybody, but they know, and they're collecting it possibly for different purposes. Well, how do we unlock that and get that out? Data that is available publicly but very poorly disseminated. Oftentimes, so many of the documents, of the data within the KNBS, the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, are in PDF documents that are sitting on the KNBS website. Well, that's not really data anymore. So, and to access that, well, now we've got these great apps that can sort of suck data out of PDFs, but that's a bit awkward. So how do we then better disseminate the data? How do we disaggregate it? So if there's data that's collected for the population, can we disaggregate it around gender, around quintiles? And can we begin to understand the data differently? Pull it apart. What are the elements that go into the indicators that are being published, and can we access those? And then where there are real gaps, well, what more should we be gathering? Very interested, for example, across, we try and collect across the continent, like how many houses are there? That's a really hard number, and you would think that shouldn't be so hard because they're visible. We should be, so we will, if we can do it aerially, but for a continent, that's a big exercise to do. And are they being, where are those, the delivery of those? We talked about the permitting system, I think, earlier this morning. As permits are passed and approved, those go into a municipality. Well, how can we access that data and aggregate it at a national level to begin to get a sense of market activity? So we did that, and we presented this back to colleagues in Kenya and said, well, how do we take this forward? We've got some very targeted recommendations, and for each institution, their responsibility spans way beyond housing. How do we get them to focus specifically on housing? So we entered into a relationship with the KNBS specifically. And they asked for a dashboard where they could present their data quite beautifully in a whole range of pictures on the website. And we said, that's fine, but actually we want, all of the practitioners want to have the data in their hands. They actually want to be able to access it and put it into their own spreadsheets and work with it. So can we put the raw data? Is that possible? They're right now in PDF documents. Can we put the raw data on the website? And with them, we developed a proposal to create a data explorer, which was quite seriously influenced by Hofinet and the practicality of Hofinet to give access directly to data. But what we discovered then in working with Kenya, and it's the point that Mohammed made this morning, is that the KMBS itself, what we needed to do, it wasn't just putting the data in a data explorer on the website, but it was building the full data pipeline from where it was actually collected and how does it filter through so that it's not interfered with by a person, which in fact was the original proposal. Take the data from a report, write down the number, put it into a spreadsheet, and then publish it on the website. And this exercise has been incredibly intense. The Data Explorer will be launched, I hope, at the end of this month. 24 indicators. That's all we could do. Of the 115 we were looking for across 9 countries, we maybe found half of them in each country. And these are basic numbers. The numbers do exist somewhere, right? Because housing is happening. There is activity. But the mechanism to get them, to create the pipeline. And so it's not only a capacity building issue, it's also the mechanics of the pipeline, of making sure that the data can get through from when it is experienced and then collected into and on a regular and sustainable basis on an ongoing basis. Working with the KMBS to convince them that this was worthwhile has also been difficult because 24 indicators and we spent all this money and it took us all of this time. And that's going to be an ongoing thing. Once we launch it, we're going to continue. We're going to have to figure out how to use it. Please, all of you, use it. Because that usage statistics will help them know that it's important and comment and engage with it. What we've then done is, it was influenced a little bit by some of what we've been doing in South Africa, where we couldn't articulate what is affordable housing. And this is looking 10, 15 years ago. How do we actually see affordable housing? The only data that we had pre-Zillow, kind of pre-internet, was newspapers, right? That's where you can see what housing is available by looking through the newspaper. And the real problem with affordable housing is it doesn't transact as frequently as higher value housing, certainly in the South African context, but I think in other countries as well. And so how do we start to demonstrate what is available and then create, because of course all the players are developing their habits for how they work with a market without data. How do you build the opportunity for data? So we took deeds registry data and we decided to put it, initially it was on a Google map, and that was probably about 10 years ago. And then the record level data became too expensive to buy, and we didn't have access to it publicly through the public deeds registry itself. So we were buying indicators. And this dashboard here is showing the level of mortgage lending that's happening. I'm showing you the national picture, which of course is too broad, but you can dig deeply down not only into city, but actually into neighborhood to see the level of mortgage lending, the distribution of properties by very broad value bands, but with an emphasis on the affordable market. And what doing this did, we didn't do it with any permission from the government. We bought the data from a data provider, but then we took it back to the government, and we got support from the National Treasury to do this, and we showed municipalities, your valuation role actually does the same thing because you're getting your data directly from the deeds registry and you have a valuation. You could do this by yourselves. And we've been working with them about how to build that analytical framework so that they can start to look at the way in which property prices and lending and transactions all work. Mick suggested that I would talk about informal, and what this shows here is that you can't see the informal because we're using deeds registry data. It's a huge gap in that. Okay. In Kenya, access to that deeds registry is more difficult, and it isn't as widely representative yet as we would want or need to. So what we've done recently in Kenya is use actually just developers' websites and brochures, property brochures. And we've collected a database of about 18,000 developments, 18,000 units across a number of developments in the greater Nairobi area, where we've pulled together a number of metrics, the number of bedrooms, the size of the unit, the service charges applied, anything that we can find. It's a very haphazard process. We're collecting it manually. But the reason we're doing it, first, we can put it on a map, which is very nice, that very many slice pie graph there shows a level of activity and volume. When you click on one of those, you can dig deeper into a neighborhood. And I don't know if you can see the words going over the pie graph there's a section there that says no data. I'm very happy to publish when there is no data, because I want the developer to say, I can give you that. So it becomes a lobbying tool, and I think what becomes really important is that we need to crowdsource our information, and that when you start to show what's already publicly available in this aggregated format, and with this, it's going to be launched by the end of the month, in beta version, because there are real glitches and we need to fix them, but I would rather launch it that way with that kind of a disclaimer to encourage all of the potential data providers to participate and fix it, because that's how we're going. And this must be live. We need to be doing this on an ongoing basis. Hopefully someone will see that there's an amazing market opportunity here, and they'll go ahead and they'll do it, and we'll have Zillow in Kenya. But my sense is it'll probably only address the higher end, and that's when we need to start innovating about how do we calculate what's possible at the bottom end. So we've been trying to understand what constitutes housing affordability, and what goes into the cost of the house. And initially, well, developers just didn't want to tell us. They wouldn't tell us how much the brick costs or how much, the house is selling for $30,000. Well, how much did it cost to build that? Very difficult to get market information. So it was about 8 years ago that we said, well, why don't we just try and do it again in a way to prompt developers to argue with us. So we designed a fictional house, like a Big Mac, kind of, and we were building a Big Mac index. We designed a fictional house with 400 building material components within a bill of quantities. We sent that to 15 quantity surveyors across the continent and said, can you price this for us? How much would it cost to build a 20-unit development somewhere fairly well located? We were flexible. And that very first effort, based on a fictional house, the very same house was $23,000 in Port Elizabeth in South Africa and $63,000 in Nairobi, Kenya. So a $40,000 difference of that very same house. It wasn't an affordable house in either context necessarily. That wasn't what we just wanted to see what would happen if we asked the same question to people in different jurisdictions. That started to raise eyebrows, and people started to think, well, what does that mean? And then the graph on the left shows, so orange is land, green is infrastructure. The legend is there. You can probably read it better than I can. And we wanted to see ratios as well. What was the difference where in some cases the land cost was significant, in other cases the infrastructure cost, and what were the policy issues that went into that? So that created a really useful ground for conversation. What we've now started to do is to take this methodology and apply it to real live projects. So the projects themselves are different, and that's the graph on the right, which is different housing types with different specifications in Ghana. And there what becomes particularly interesting is the ratios. Again, that if you build one particular kind of house, you might save on infrastructure, but the land costs are higher because it's in a good location, and so on. This information we then have used as part of how we start to think about the impact of housing on the economy, because we've been calling it like the bottom-up method. When there isn't the data to calculate the impact of residential construction on the economy, we follow this method to begin to find our way into the number. And that's, again, started to create a demand for data. And that's ultimately what we're wanting to do here, is that we're presenting numbers that are debatable. And that makes a wonderful basis for debate. And then we can have a conversation about, well, where is there better data that can come into that? So the last thing that we're doing now is we've called it the Open Access Initiative, and recognizing that so much of the work that CAF, my organization, does, and many of the DFIs, is at the dark blue and the white circle level. That's about as far as we can go. And the really interesting stuff is what happens in an actual project or within an actual book of a lender. Or in an actual neighborhood. So can we start to drill down by crowdsourcing data from the participants who are actually creating it? So what we've done is on the public sector side, we're trying to pull data that's being collected as part of the regulatory process. And on the private sector side, to work with participants in the housing sector to prove us wrong when we've said other things previously, and to say, well, we can do it better. Here's the data to prove it. And if we pull those two together, we start to get some more coverage as you were describing.
I have a lot of questions for Keisha, but I'm just wondering if you're using any data from some of the mapping that's being done, land use mapping from SDI that's doing neighborhood mapping, as well as Cadastra and the UN Habitat's STDM type of mapping to get into the neighborhood data, if that's something you're doing. And secondly, I wanted to ask you about how are you differentiating? In one of your slides, you had urban and city and national, and how are you differentiating those as well? Thanks.
The second one is easy. That city is the city. So it's a particular city that we choose. So it would be urban, and then it would be Nairobi, and so on. And those different levels of aggregation are interesting because they're often quite difficult to get. We're happy to go in either direction. So maybe Nairobi has data that doesn't exist at a national level, and we're filling all of that in. In terms of neighborhood mapping, I think that that's excellent. In South Africa, is where we get closest to neighborhood right now. But that's coming now in Kenya, because that's where we're piloting the Open Access Initiative. And in Nigeria will as well. And I think that the overlaying, I think it's something also, Nancy, that you talked about, is really important. What we do have to recognize is different data collected for different purposes with different definitions. And to really be careful and honest about that. While also allowing your brain to work out how it all fits together, right? And a map is very useful for that, because at least the place is constant. And then you have different data that means different things in the same place, and that becomes part of the analytical process.
Just one question. In your presentation, I didn't hear much about how you can rely on intermediaries like brokers, real estate agents, and appraisers. I've tried in some countries, it's very, very difficult, either because of lack of reliable data or lack of will of sharing the data, even if you love to use your platform, but I didn't see reciprocity. How does it work? Have you seen cases where you could use these intermediaries? And if yes, how?
There's a house price index that has been produced in Nigeria by Roland Igbinoba. It's called the Roland Igbinoba House Price Index. Those of you who know Roland would understand that. And it uses broker data or estate agent data to establish that. The downside is it's the it's the list price, not the selling price, because once the sale has happened, they're not looking at it anymore. So then, I'm happy though, because it's a step towards saying this is something we want to know. And again, then the brokers and the agents can look at that and say, well, actually, we have a better number, which is the sale price, and if we can distinguish between the two. So that was an experiment. Data sharing is so difficult, and to get people to share, it's very difficult. And the way in which we try to do that is by showing them what we know and seeing if they can prove us wrong.
One quick comment and then a question. So, Keisha, I was very encouraged when I saw land costs as a share of housing cost in the 5 African cities. It was really low. And that was kind of surprising to me. So I guess I'm curious whether it's surprising to you. But the other thing comes back to, and I'm trying to remember which of the three of you talked about how good data builds trust, and that's correct. But the flip side is you need the trust before you get the data, which is, and I did a project in Ukraine about 15, 16 years ago, trying to do this, and the thing nobody wanted to share, because nobody trusted anybody else, and they thought they were going to use the information against them somehow, which made it very frustrating. So I'd be curious about your comments on land costs, but just in general, any thoughts about how do you engender the kind of trust that leads to the ability to collect correct information?
On land costs, I was also surprised, and I think partly that's because we don't have that full database of land costs anyway, and what is land, when we're looking at land costs, are we looking at with infrastructure, without infrastructure? So these are costs without infrastructure because the infrastructure is separated. I'm looking forward to digging deeper with the more precise by development approach. So I can't answer that fully for you. I also thought it was, surprising. In terms of engendering trust, a big thing has to do with definitions, and I'll look at Maria for that because that's how I came to understand that, is that in order to be able to stand next to something, or for anyone else to, we go to the World Bank website and we use those numbers all the time, right? 'Cause it's the World Bank. And so it must be right, and I really hope it is. And the downside is that in order to realize that, it takes a really long time for that number to get onto the website, an enormous amount of time, and then it sometimes loses its currency. Within Kenya, one of the things they were most concerned about was that they didn't want to publish a number on the KMBS website that they couldn't stand behind, which is great. But for them, they meant that that was in a report that had already been vetted and approved. And we found some holes in that process as well. So I think that the trust has to be, it's through kind of trial and error and really good, rigorous systems. That's why we did opt for a data pipeline initiative within the KMBS to make sure that the whole process of where the number comes from and how it finally gets onto the website can be replicated, and that the reader of the website can find where it came from originally.
I think that's one of the things that came out yesterday. Like, a lot of the solutions are not just technical solutions, it's really how the processes that we can contribute to get put in place, and those political economy and relationship question. Based on your experience, this building trust element you have.
I think maybe just what I'll add to what Keisha was saying is this is not a process that will work in a one-time interaction. I think just like in anything, in any relationship, building that trust takes years and takes openness, takes the willingness also to recognize when mistakes have been made and be able to make that process of engaging around data and building trust, making it really something that is an interactive process, a dialogue around an output that many parties want to use in the end. So I would say that we should move away from thinking about as producing one output and putting it up, but rather, like Kesha was explaining it throughout her presentation, using it as a way to create a dialogue that hopefully would take you even to a better product or to a product that evolves, changes, and is always improving rather than a static data output, I would say.
We work closely with statistical offices and central banks and statistics departments thereof, and we're very clear about this type of issue, and they are as well because of the reputational risk. And what we insist is there's transparency to all of this and data dissemination. So there's a large document that goes with it explaining the methods, warts and all, that go through things, and also the progress. And sometimes the series is labeled experimental just to sort of signal that this is standard. And the feedback is encouraged, this type of point that Nancy makes. It's a two-way mechanism. And it's built up gradually over the years. And sometimes when it's not working, as was a number of countries we've had, then they come clean about it. That's the idea, that they make a public statement that this is, we've had biases in formula, which we've managed to reduce inflation in some East African countries by half, just by finding the measurement problem. And the central banks can go, that was easy. So it's this type of thing. But they came clean, and they reissued the whole thing. Yeah.